Larry Apel was a man whose presence was felt before he was seen, a titan of industry and blood etched with dragon tattoos that scaled his neck like living armor. He was the king of iron, a predator in pinstripes whose silent commands moved mountains and the city's highest spires. Yet, his greatest vulnerability was not the rival syndicates or the federal task forces circling his empire. It was the son who sat across from him, a 20-year ghost in a body of muscle and ink. Harry had not uttered a single syllable since the moment he was born, a silence that many whispered was Larry's divine penance for a lifetime of violence. That silence held through 7,300 grueling days until a cold evening in the penthouse, where the city lights glittered like jagged diamonds through the floor-to-ceiling glass. When the most feared man in the underworld felt his reality fracture, his son spoke, not to him, but toward a woman who had just walked into their world of stone. The Apel penthouse wasn't merely a residence. It was a fortress of minimalist luxury, a glass and steel sanctuary where power was the only breath permitted. The atmosphere was as sharp as the crease in Larry's suit, heavy with the scent of expensive bourbon and the weight of secrets kept in the dark. This was where destinies were decided over mahogany desks and whispered ultimatums. Freda smoothed the fabric of her emerald dress in the service corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs despite her outward composure. At 24, she carried a regal confidence that masked the weariness of a woman drowning in a family debt she hadn't earned. She was a vibrant contrast to the cold, monochrome world of the Mafia king, radiating a warmth that felt like an immediate threat to the penthouse's suffocating stillness. As she stepped into the room, her gaze, unyielding and bright, met the predatory, unblinking eyes of the silent heir, and the 2 decades of silence finally began to crack. Freda arrived at the penthouse for her first shift, her heart hammering against her ribs as she was buzzed through the secured entrance. Her assigned station was the inner sanctum, a breathtaking, glass-walled office that seemed to float above the city's glittering lights. The air inside was cool, fragrant with expensive cologne, leather, and old money. There he was, Larry Apel, the king of iron. As a child of the lower city, she'd only known him as a specter of legend, a name whispered when debts were collected too effectively. In person, sitting behind that terrifying slab of mahogany, he was far more tangible. A 3-piece pinstriped suit hugged a frame that still seemed more brute force than finesse. The dragon tattoos scaled his neck, ancient and dark, giving his gaze an unsettling edge. Next to him sat Harry, the muscular, 20-year-old ghost who was supposed to be the heir. But Freda's eyes quickly went back to Larry. Across the desk sat a nervous-looking man in a rumpled shirt. His debt, apparently, was a dragon's debt. Larry spoke. His voice was a velvet rasp, low, almost soft. "You were given grace, Mr. Vance." The man stammered, his eyes darting toward Harry. Freda felt her breath catch. This was it. She'd always imagined the violence would be thunderous, but Larry merely closed a small black notebook. "Grace has expired," Larry said, and in that silence, Freda understood. The violence was not in the sound, it was in the absolute absence of mercy. The tension in the penthouse was a physical weight, thick enough to dull the clink of silverware. Freda's hands, usually steady, betrayed her as she leaned over the mahogany expanse. The bottle of 1945 Romanée Conti slipped, a dark, arterial spray erupting across the pinstriped shoulder of the King of Iron. Larry didn't flinch. He simply froze, his tattooed dragons shimmering like oil under the chandelier. The silence that followed was the 7,301st day of Harry's vow, a vacuum that felt ready to implode. Larry's eyes remained fixed on the spreading stain, his jaw tightening into a ridge of granite. But then, a sound cracked the stillness, not the expected roar of Larry's fury, but a low, rusted vibration from the opposite side of the desk. "It's just grapes, Father." The words were raw, scraping through a throat unused to the friction of air. Larry's head snapped toward his son, his predator's mask finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The silent heir had exhaled 2 decades of defiance in a single breath. In that moment, the mahogany desk felt less like a throne and more like a barricade that had finally, irrevocably failed. Would you like me to write Chapter 3, where Larry reacts to this sudden shift in power? The King of Iron did not believe in coincidences. he believed in vectors of attack. As the red stain on his pinstripes began to dry, Larry's gaze shifted from his son's resurrected voice to the trembling woman holding the empty bottle. To him, Freda was no longer a clumsy server. She was the catalyst that had cracked a 20-year seal. "You aren't going anywhere," Larry murmured, his voice a low, rhythmic threat that seemed to vibrate through the mahogany. When Freda stepped back, her heels clicking against the marble, the heavy double doors of the penthouse thudded shut. Two men, their silhouettes as jagged and unforgiving as the city skyline, stepped into the light. By sunset, the penthouse had transformed from a workplace into a gilded vault. Freda was ushered into a suite draped in raw silk and scented with jasmine, yet the view of the city felt like a taunt. Every corner held a shadow, and every shadow held a guard. Larry was convinced she was a plant, a siren sent by his rivals to lure the truth out of Harry's throat. Surrounded by unimaginable luxury, Freda realized the terrifying truth. The king had traded his mercy for a beautiful, high-altitude cage. "Would you like me to write Chapter 4, where Freda tries to find an ally within the penthouse walls?" The King of Iron did not believe in coincidences. He believed in vectors of attack. As the red stain on his pinstripes began to dry, Larry's gaze shifted from his son's resurrected voice to the trembling woman holding the empty bottle. To him, Freda was no longer a clumsy server. She was the catalyst that had cracked a 20-year seal. "You aren't going anywhere," Larry murmured, his voice a low, rhythmic threat that seemed to vibrate through the mahogany. When Freda stepped back, her heels clicking against the marble, the heavy double doors of the penthouse thudded shut. Two men, their silhouettes as jagged and unforgiving as the city skyline, stepped into the light. By sunset, the penthouse had transformed from a workplace into a gilded vault. Freda was ushered into a suite draped in raw silk and scented with jasmine, yet the view of the city felt like a taunt. Every corner held a shadow, and every shadow held a guard. Larry was convinced she was a plant, a siren sent by his rivals to lure the truth out of Harry's throat. Surrounded by unimaginable luxury, Freda realized the terrifying truth. The king had traded his mercy for a beautiful, high-altitude cage. "Would you like me to write Chapter 4, where Freda tries to find an ally within the penthouse walls?" The penthouse air, usually a sterile blend of luxury and stillness, curdled into something lethal. Larry stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, his pinstriped back to the room, the dragon on his neck appearing to writhe in the moonlight. Without turning, he gestured, and his shadows moved. Freda felt the cold bite of steel as she was forced onto the mahogany desk, the king's altar of debt. "A spy is a leak," Larry murmured, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "And leaks must be plugged." He didn't look at Freda. His predator's gaze was locked on Harry, who stood paralyzed in the corner. Larry drew a weighted, silver letter opener, its edge catching the city lights as he pressed it against Freda's throat. A thin bead of crimson bloomed against the silk of her collar. The test was silent, a brutal binary. Would the heir sacrifice his 20-year shield for a stranger, or would he let the King of Iron's mercy expire once more? The mahogany groaned under Freda's weight as she gasped, her eyes pleading with the ghost in the corner. Larry's hand remained steady, a machine of flesh and ink, waiting for the crack in the silence that would prove his son was still human, and therefore still breakable. As the blade's chill lingered against her skin, Freda's gaze fell upon a tarnished silver locket that had spilled from Larry's open desk drawer during the struggle. Inside, a grainy photograph stared back, a younger Larry, his skin yet unblemished by the ink of dragons, standing shoulder to shoulder with a man whose laugh she carried in her own marrow. It was her father, a man she believed had died a pauper's death in the shipyards. The realization hit her harder than any physical blow. The King of Iron hadn't built his throne alone. He had climbed over the literal bones of the only man Freda had ever loved. The pinstriped predator finally turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw her recognition of the relic. In that heavy silence, the air in the penthouse shifted from a simple hostage crisis to a generational reckoning. Her father hadn't just been a worker. He had been the architect of the very debts Larry now collected with such clinical cruelty. Freda wasn't just a random server or a suspected spy. She was a ghost of the king's own making, a living reminder of the original sin that had fueled his rise to power. The digital heartbeat of the penthouse flatlined in a heartbeat. The city lights beyond the glass flickered and died, swallowed by a predatory darkness as the syndicate's sirens began their digital feast. Larry's mahogany empire was under siege, the screens behind him bleeding a frantic, scrolling red, a cyber attack designed to blind the King of Iron. Sensing the crack in the mute prince's armor, rivals who had waited decades in the shadows finally smelled blood in the water. The silence was shattered not by words, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a battering ram against the reinforced titanium doors. The floor-to-ceiling windows vibrated with the approach of blacked-out helicopters, their rotors a mechanical roar that drowned out the king's velvet threats. Larry's living armor seemed to darken as he drew a weapon from a hidden compartment in his desk, his composure fracturing into raw, jagged survivalism. Freda and Harry were no longer just prisoners. They were the focal point of a storm. As the first flashbang detonated, painting the room in a blinding, caustic white, the syndicate made its move to claim the throne Larry had built on the bones of his friends. The titanium doors buckled, shrieking as the syndicate's vanguard flooded the sanctuary in a hail of shattered glass and suppressive fire. Larry, the King of Iron, was pinned behind his mahogany altar, his pinstriped armor shredded by the chaos. The shadows he once commanded were faltering, his guards retreating into a disorganized panic as the darkness of the siege swallowed their resolve. Then, the vacuum of 20 years finally collapsed. "Hold the line." The voice didn't just break the silence, it commanded it. Harry stood in the center of the carnage, his rusted vocal cords vibrating with a resonant, terrifying authority that mirrored his father, but possessed a raw, new fire. The mute prince was a ghost no longer. He moved through the smoke like a vengeful god, his tattooed muscles tensed as he barked tactical orders that snapped the wavering guards back into a lethal formation. Larry watched, stunned, as his son's voice became a weapon more potent than any blade. Harry wasn't just speaking, he was claiming the throne in the middle of a war zone. For the first time in his life, the King of Iron felt the cold weight of his own obsolescence. The tower was falling, but a new king was rising from the rubble. The smoke of the siege settled like a funeral shroud over the ruined mahogany. Larry Apel sat amidst the wreckage, his pinstriped suit scorched, and his living armor, dulled by the gray ash of defeat. The King of Iron looked smaller now, a predator whose claws had been drawn by the very ghost he had raised. He watched in a hollow, rhythmic silence as Harry stepped over the debris, his presence no longer a shadow, but a sun around which the remaining guards now gravitated. With a final, trembling exhale, Larry pushed himself away from the desk, the throne he had occupied through blood and original sin. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say to a son who had found a voice louder than his own. Harry turned to the men, his gaze settling on Freda, who stood bruised but unbroken in the center of the gilded vault. His voice, once a rusted secret, now rang out with the clarity of a bell. "The dead of the father is buried in this rubble," he declared, his hand finding hers. "She is no longer a prisoner nor a servant. From this breath forward, she is the conscience of this house." The new reign had begun, not with a roar of violence, but with a vow that finally silenced the old king for good.